Back, everyone. So, starting here in our second part of our part one discussion of the endocrine system, we're going to begin looking at classifications of hormones. So, if you haven't watched the first part, go and watch the first part first, and then if you have, we'll pick up here with part two. So, talking about types of hormones, we'll talk about kind of three general categories and what are called steroid hormones, protein or peptide hormones, and then one's called amine hormones or amino acid derived. So the first, and what these are describing here, what we're simply talking about is the structure of the hormone, or what it's derived from. So what is the hormone itself being made from, right? So the first category are called steroid hormones, right? Steroid hormones are derived from cholesterol, so they're derived from lipids, right? So you may also see these called lipid-soluble hormones, right? So if you see the term a lipid-soluble hormone, a steroid hormone, those are referring to the same thing, right? And know that they come from cholesterol, right? You find cholesterol in the plasma membrane of animal cells. You have it in your plasma membrane of your cells. It's normal. It's a normal part of our cells. But sometimes we have this connotation, or we think of cholesterol in this kind of negative light, and it has this negative connotation. But cholesterol, in and of itself, is necessary and a good thing, right? So these are things like estrogen, testosterone, cortisol that we'll talk about. So from the adrenal glands. As we'll see in a little bit, and really what's kind of also differentiating these different types of circulating hormones is not only what they're derived from, but also how they're transported in the blood. So how do you carry the hormone from its secreting cell to its target cell? And then also, how does it act on its receptor once it reaches its target receptor, right? So these are other considerations that we'll look at when talking about hormones, right? The second class are called amines or monoamines or biogenic amines. Big thing here, these are derived from amino acids. Okay, these are derived from amino acids, typically either tyrosine, a tyrosine amino acid, or another amino acid called tryptophan. One of those amino acids are what these amine hormones are derived from, right? Now, these, unlike the lipid-soluble steroid hormones, these are water-soluble, right? Note with the exception of thyroid hormone, but these are water-soluble, so meaning they freely dissolve in water, and so this is going to affect, again, how it's transported in the blood and how it acts on its receptor, right? So we're just taking an amino acid and moving around one of these functional groups to make a new hormone, right? So thyroid hormone, epinephrine, norepinephrine, things like that, these are all amine hormones, right? And then the third major category are similar to the amine hormones, but these are called protein-based hormones. And these are simply, instead of one amino acid, it's a string of amino acids, right? So each of these little colored circles here, each one of those is an amino acid. So you notice it's very long, right? So we talked about protein synthesis in AMP1, right? Transcription, translation. You link amino acids together during translation. That's essentially what has occurred here, right? So it's these chains of amino acids. They behave in a similar way to our amine or monoamine hormones in the sense that they are water soluble. So again, they're going to dissolve freely in water, which will affect how they travel in the blood and how they act on their target receptor, right? So these are things like ADH, antidiuretic hormone, insulin, glucagon, growth hormone, erythropoietin or EPO. All of these are protein-based water-soluble hormone, right? So whenever you hear the term water-soluble, think amino acid-based, protein-based, right? When you hear the term lipid-soluble or fat-soluble, think steroid hormone, testosterone, estrogen, aldosterone, something like that, right? And again, these are going to affect or relate to how they travel in the blood, right? Now, there are other types of hormones, okay, or other types of signaling molecules that are acting in a more local manner, right? So many of these that we've looked at or we've alluded to are the hormones themselves. They're really traveling a great distance from their cell that is secreting them to their target cell. So meaning We are releasing a cell from the pancreas, and it's going all the way to cells in the leg to act on the receptor to bring in glucose, right? So it's acting a great distance away. You also have what's called autocrine signaling, or autocrine stimulation, and paracrine stimulation. Autocrine, if you look at the root word auto is meaning self. So what this means is this is a molecule that has released or a cell that has released a molecule, and that molecule is acting on the cell itself, the same cell that released it. And so these are often associated with things like the immune system can act sometimes in this kind of autocrine signaling, right? You also have paracrine signaling, and this can also occur in the immune system, in which one cell is releasing a molecule, some signaling molecule that acts on a nearby cell, so a neighboring cell. So not the same cell, not the cell itself, not a distant cell like we see with hormone, with endocrine signaling with hormones, but these are paracrine, so these are neighboring or nearby cells, right? Nearby cells. Other types of local hormones that are acting in a more local manner are what are called eicosanoids, and eicosanoids are derived from what's called arachidonic acid. Okay, and arachidonic acid is like a fatty acid. It's this long string of carbons, and that arachidonic acid can be created or can be transformed into a number of different types of eicosanoids, and one of these are called prostaglandins, right? Prostaglandins, and so prostaglandins, you know about prostaglandins even if you don't know that you know about prostaglandins. So prostaglandins are produced when a particular type of enzyme called cyclooxygenase, COX, it's sometimes just called COX, the COX enzyme, COX, there's a COX-1 and a COX-2, but the cyclooxygenase converts arachidonic acid, which again is like a fatty acid, a string of carbons, into a prostanoid, and prostaglandins are one type. And prostaglandins can act on pain receptors and initiate inflammation, right? So anytime you take aspirin or you take an NSAID, so a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug, so maybe something like ibuprofen, so Advil, you are acting to block the activity of cyclooxygenase, right? When you block that COX enzyme and you block prostaglandin synthesis, you then block the things that prostaglandins stimulate or contribute to, which in this case are things like pain and things like inflammation, right? So that is all well and good. That's great. However, there are other COX enzymes that, so remember it's an enzyme, cyclooxygenase, it ends in ASE, so you know that it's an enzyme, ASE. There are other COX enzymes that also produce prostaglandins, but that have to do with other functions in the body, and one of these are in the stomach that produce that mucus lining on the inside of the stomach, right? And so with this, the reason this can be not as beneficial whenever you're taking Advil or something like that is that, yes, you may be blocking pain, you may be blocking inflammation, but if you're also blocking the production of that mucus that lines the stomach, you can end up with ulcers. You can end up with gastric ulcers. And so one potential complication of long-term NSAID use, so long-term Advil use, is the risk of developing a gastric ulcer, right? And so this is something that is advised against if you take Advil for a long time. So here are some questions that you can ask yourself related to some of the information we just discussed, right? So I've alluded a few times that the nature of the hormone, so meaning is it lipid soluble or water soluble, and again, think about what that means. The nature of the hormone will affect or be related to two other things: how the hormone is transported in the blood, and then how it acts on its receptor. Okay, so one of these is its transport in the blood. So two options here: the hormone will circulate freely, or it will circulate bound. Okay, so meaning it's going to be attached to some other carrier, some other protein, or it's not going to be attached to that, right? So think about this whenever you think about which type of hormone, so amino acid based, protein based, lipid based, which one of these is going to require a carrier protein? Think about the nature of what it's being carried in, the blood. So think about blood. What is blood mostly, right? What is blood primarily? Blood is primarily water, right? So if something that is lipid based or lipid soluble, is it going to be able to freely dissolve in water? No, it's not going to be able to. So anything that is lipid soluble is going to require a carrier protein. So your lipid soluble hormones, so think estrogen, testosterone, aldosterone, things like that, they're going to require a carrier protein, right? So these carrier proteins will bind their hormone, carry it through the blood until it gets to its receptor, and we'll talk about what happens at its receptor later on, right? Most of the time when you have a water-soluble hormone, these are traveling freely in the blood, right? And a few of them use transport proteins. So think something like thyroid hormone. We said it's protein-based, but it's or amino acid-based, but it's not water-soluble. So this is an exception. But for the most part, if it's water-soluble and it's in blood, which is mostly water, it's going to be able to freely dissolve and be transported, right? So it does not require a carrier protein, right, for the most part. Now, the presence of a carrier protein can also protect the hormone, right? So whenever you have a carrier protein, and maybe these are produced by the liver, maybe it's albumin or something like that, when you have this carrier protein and you're transporting the hormone, it's actually protecting it from degradation. It's protecting it from breakdown. So the half-life, as we'll see, of lipid-soluble hormones is typically a little bit greater than that of water-soluble hormones, right? Now, whenever you have these hormones that have been released, they're circulating, bound to a carrier, not bound, they're free. There are ways that you can relate the amount of hormone to its release and its elimination, right? So what this means is that hormone release, so the release of a hormone, and the amount of the hormone in the blood are directly related to each other, right? So essentially what this is saying is the more you release a hormone, the more hormone you're going to find in your blood, right? And that should make pretty good sense, right? Whenever you have that hormonal stimulation, when you have a humoral stimulation, right, that is causing a cell or a gland to release hormone, the more it releases, the greater the concentration in the plasma is going to be, right? Hormone elimination is exactly the same, except that it's totally opposite, right? So in other words, the rate at which you eliminate a hormone from the body is indirectly or inversely related to the amount of hormone in the blood. So meaning, if you increase the amount of hormone that you're breaking down and removing from the body, the less hormone you're going to have in the blood, right, or in the plasma. And so things like our kidney, liver may be able to degrade and break down our hormones as they're circulating through, and that is going to decrease hormone levels, which may then stimulate the need for additional hormone secretion, right? So again, we'll have more hormone release, we'll have greater levels in the plasma, and then we'll begin to eliminate them, and they'll begin to decrease, right? So again, all of this is or a lot of this has to do with homeostasis, right? So we're in this homeostatic mechanism or homeostatic feedback loop, right? Maybe something like negative feedback, right? Now, I alluded to half-life earlier. I'm not gonna spend a ton of time on half-life, but essentially what half-life is the amount of time that it takes for half of the amount or the half of the concentration of a hormone to be lost, right? So in other words, eliminated by the liver, by the kidney, something like that, right? So if you have a short half-life, that means that you will need to secrete the hormone more frequently or more often to maintain concentration, right? Or maintain the same concentration. If a hormone has a longer half-life and it takes longer to reduce the amount of that hormone, then it's going to be able to stay at a given level in the body, in the plasma, for a longer period of time, right? So Water-soluble hormones typically have a short half-life. Steroid hormones typically have a little bit longer half-life, right? And again, think about why that is. So again, peptide hormones, maybe our amine hormones, they typically have a little bit shorter, and then steroid hormones typically have a little bit longer. So again, think about why that is. We said that our steroid hormones, right? Are steroid hormones lipid soluble or water soluble, right? Are they lipid soluble or water soluble? Hopefully you're saying they're lipid soluble, right? So they're not dissolving in the blood. So that means they need what? They need a carrier protein, right? And so if you have that carrier protein that binds the hormone, it protects it, and it typically increases the half-life, making it keeping it at a greater concentration for a longer period of time, right? So consider these questions. We're going to stop here, and we're going to pick up with our next part, talking about more details of both lipid and water-soluble hormones, and then we'll get into looking at what happens at their receptor.